Our next guest is a columnist with the Guardian newspaper in the UK. Would you please welcome Owen Jones? Wherever you want.
Hello. Hi. Hi, guys.
Owen, thanks for coming. You were already in Dublin,
yes,
weren't you? You were on Virgin Media, and you had a bit of banter, as you'd say in England, with our former Justice Minister, Alan Shatter.
I think a great crack, as I think many would say. Yeah, I mean, he was an interesting character. I didn't know who he was until I Googled him, which was. I mean, that's a pretty, I'd say, classic, direct Irish description. Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting though, isn't it? Because obviously you do have, in Britain, there's such a big consensus about being slavishly pro-Israel. And actually here you've got a right-wing government, but for obvious historical reasons, Ireland is more one of the most sympathetic nations to the Palestinian people in the whole of Europe. So they kind of managed to scrape together one of their only devoutly pro-Israel politicians. He was not happy at the end of it, I have to say. He stormed off. Israel generally has lost, and I do think we need to keep saying this. It is a catastrophic strategic defeat for Israel, moral collapse. That's not in any way any consolation or in any way detracts from the horror of a genocidal onslaught against the Palestinian people and the misery and suffering and death they're going to impose in the coming weeks and months, as they have over the last few weeks and months. That in no way detracts from that. But I think pro-Israel politicians are flailing around desperately because they've lost public opinion. In Ireland, obviously, that was never going to be sympathetic territory for them. But, in the US now, more Americans than not think Israel is committing genocide. There's a large majority of Americans now obviously oppose Israel's genocidal onslaught. So even in the nations in the West, where it was like verboten not to be pro-Israel, they've lost public opinion. I mean, in Britain, by 19th of October, the polling showed over half of Brits supported, they said they definitely supported an immediate ceasefire. 16% said they probably did, and only 3% said they definitely opposed an immediate ceasefire, which is the same number as think the earth is flat. And that was 2 weeks in. And that's in Britain, I just think it's such, they've lost catastrophically, and all they've got is smear, lie, deflection. And you saw him trying that, in the most desperate way possible. Projection. They always do projection.
Just on that, I mean, can you see similarities in how the Zionist movement has behaved in terms of different strategies that they've used within media to kind of push their cause?
Well, I mean, that's always been the strategy, of course. I mean, there's what defenders of the occupation, the longest belligerent occupation in modern times, have done is try to use what is a genuine evil, anti-Semitism, which exists. And what they do to portray anyone who stands against one of the great injustices of our time, and I'm talking about even before this genocidal onslaught, is obviously accuse people of anti-Semitism and of being dupes for terrorism. And it's so irresponsible, because anti-Semitism is clearly, I would say, on the rise globally. It's responsible for the most heinous single crime in human history within living memory. And all their strategy is now doing, because I think it has been effective in the past, what it's now doing, given it's just not possible to suppress the scale of this crime. It's just too big, it's too blatant, and it's too unapologetic. And what they're doing is making people distrust the very term anti-Semitism. And that's actually dangerous, because people do need to understand anti-Semitism exists. It's just not the same as conflating opposition to the crimes of the Israeli state with hatred of the Jewish people, which is what they've tried to do. I think what I'm frustrated about is it does work in so much that, interesting, Gary Lineker in the UK, the most, I'd say, beloved sports personality in the country. And he's come under a huge attack. He came under a huge attack, actually, because, to begin with, is because he quote tweeted an interview I did with the Israeli-American Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Raz Sigal, who I interviewed a few months ago. In fact, I'm interviewing him again tomorrow. And he said that this is a textbook genocide. And he said, actually, it's very rare for intent to be so overt, because often states which commit genocide cover it up. They don't. They pretend it's not happening. They pretend there's humanitarian motives, and you basically have to get leaked documents to find out what their actual intent is. And the point he was making is actually, if you look at the statements of Israeli leaders and officials and generals and soldiers, it's so rare for overt genocidal rhetoric to be spoken. He shared a clip saying this is well worth your time, and then he got attacked across all newspapers with anonymous leaks suggesting Jewish staff members weren't comfortable working with him. And again, to repeat, he'd quote tweeted an interview with an Israeli-American associate professor of Holocaust and genocide studies. And I think the problem with that attack was a lot of people probably read those newspaper articles and thought, he probably knows what he's talking about. Because they had to quote, at first it was like, Gary Lineker, anti-Semitism storm. People are like, oh my God, what's he done? And then they read it's like, he quote tweeted an interview by an Israeli-American associate professor of Holocaust and genocide studies. It doesn't really work. You read that and go, what the hell are you talking about? But the reason I'm angry is actually he has spoken out, and that's good. And I would actually regard him as one of the few consistent, well-meaning liberals. Because liberals, so-called, are terrible at being liberals. The people who call themselves liberals, when it comes to just basic, theoretical, abstract liberal principles, are shit at being liberals. And if all Gary Lineker said, he did an interview with Mehdi Hassan, who I work with this new media project called Zetio. All he said in that interview, he was basically behaving as if anyone with a public platform would behave if they genuinely just regarded Palestinians as equal human beings. You don't have to think even about the dynamics of what we're talking about here, about the occupation, about the decades of, since the Nakba and before, of the oppression of the Palestinian people, their ethnic cleansing, the suppression of their basic right for national self-determination. You don't even need to know all that. You just need to understand that there was a mass slaughter of innocent people taking place. And he just speaks from that place, basically, as a kind of well-meaning liberal. But there's so many public figures who know what's happening is wrong. They know actually it's diabolical, and they're scared to speak out. And they're scared because they think they'll be accused of being anti-Semitic or being a pawn of Hamas. And if they're pop stars or musicians, their managers are saying, don't go there, it will just damage you and damage your career. You've got nothing to gain from this. And you do get attacked. You do get your career menaced. I can speak from my own experience. It's not pleasant. But there's a genocide taking place, so you've got a responsibility if you've got a public platform to speak out when your own countries are directly complicit. So they do use these attacks and smears, and they're only currently successful in that, A, they make people stop believing in anti-Semitism, that's dangerous, and that there are enough cowardly public figures who are scared still of those attacks that they won't speak out during one of the great crimes of our time. And I tell you what's going to happen, in a few years' time, a lot of those people go, oh no, I opposed it, I spoke out, like fuck they did. And we can't let them get away with it. Because the people who... All I'd say is, you know what? Throughout history, the real people who allowed all the great horrors to happen are the silent people. There's always the deranged believers. And anyone who still supports what Israel is doing in Gaza now is, so far beyond the pale. They should just be regarded as apologists, like any other apologists for genocide in history, morally depraved people who should be driven from public life, and in some cases imprisoned for incitement to genocide, which was criminalised by the 1948 Genocide Convention, which was placed into law by multiple countries, including Ireland, as a criminal offence. But it's the silent who always allowed these crimes to happen. If the silent all spoke out, this would end immediately. If all the silent people in the United States with public platforms spoke out, this would end. And that's why I feel angry, because they're using the smears you get as an excuse, and it isn't an excuse. It just isn't an excuse.
You've been quite vocal over the years in speaking out against anti-Semitism. Have you lost friends over the stance that you've taken? Maybe, friends that would conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as it cost you friends? Has it cost you work?
My job is always, it's just like comes with the territory. It's like, how many times is my job going to get minutes this week? It's just, that firefighting comes with the territory on a whole range of fronts, this being one which has escalated since the 7th of October, and it hasn't, but again, I'm not a journalist in Gaza being blown up. When I speak to journalists in Gaza, I'm speaking at the moment with a guy called Nahed, who I interviewed a few months ago. We raised money to get him and his family out. He's looking after his kids and his brother's kids, his brother was killed by the Israeli state. We didn't get him out in time. He's now had to flee Rafah for first the ruins of Khan Yunis, which he said was like the end of the world film. What the point I'm making is you do, of course, it's important to make that point because we've gone through the biggest killing of journalists in recorded history in any conflict, and the attacks people like myself get, you do have to put it in that context. But more broadly, what I've actually found myself very educational over the years is in terms of actually in my circle, Jewish people and their experiences, and often those who have been so involved in the Palestine solidarity movement. I mean, it's so important to say that because throughout history, the left wouldn't exist without the contribution of Jewish people. One of the main reasons, often the Jewish people were attacked in the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, there's so many, and one of them was because of the disproportionate contribution of Jewish people to the left. The Nazis went on about the international Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, and they pointed to the number of Jewish people involved, obviously, in Bolshevism. Karl Marx, obviously, before that was a very good example, but everyone from Karl Marx to Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, the German and Russian left, Ukrainian left, we could go on. And, there's always been that contribution, and the Israeli state has kind of tried to snuff out that Jewish humanist tradition, but it hasn't succeeded. In the US, you see this kind of rising Jewish young left, which I think if I was Israeli, the Israeli state I'd be terrified about. Lots of Jewish people myself have actually gone on a journey, I would say as well. I mean, they've shifted because of what they've seen and experienced. But no, I don't think, even people, in my circles who oppose me would never think, even if they did agree, that I was driven by hatred of Jewish people. I don't think that's really surfaced.
I was reading an article today that you wrote a number of years ago where you basically were calling for, people to, I suppose, look at the idea of leaving the European Union. Now, obviously, a lot has happened in the UK since then. You're already gone. Basically, what your argument, as I read it, was that we could look at leaving the European Union. You were calling it Lexit from a left point of view, and that there were left arguments for leaving the European Union. You then, I think, changed your mind on that, and you would have called yourself a Remainer. But I know now that you don't support rerunning the referendum. No. But just in terms of the European Union's reaction to what's gone on in Gaza, to the genocide in Gaza, has it changed your views on the European Union and the European project? To be honest,
my views on the European Union actually have just always remained pretty static. So I wrote an article, my only contribution to the English language is I coined the word Lexit. And then...
Which I like.
Yeah, I mean, and then there was a Lexit campaign set up, which I wasn't part of, but I gave them their name. So that was good. No, the point I made in that article, that was back in 2015. I went to Greece in January 2015 when Syriza came to power, and then obviously watched, like the rest of us, Syriza being crushed and the Greek people being crushed and the catastrophe that was unleashed against the people of Greece. Germany led the charge, but it was the EU collectively snuffed that out with devastating human consequences from which Greece has never recovered. My view at the time was, so the article itself was just saying the left needs to debate whether or not we leave the European Union or have a sensible conversation about it. And I listed reasons which I stand by. It was in my critique of the European Union is, I have the same left critique of the EU as probably any other, left critique of the European Union. The way neoliberalism's enshrined within it, the democratic deficit, obviously very opposed to the euro, and obviously would have fought tooth and nail against the adoption of the single currency. In the referendum itself, I took part in a campaign called Another Europe is Possible, which was a settled will of the left and the Labour movement. I mean, obviously Jeremy Corbyn, the way he was portrayed was it was a lie. I mean, he campaigned for Remain and reform. So did all the main trade unions, Unite, led by Len McCluskey. The vast majority of the left, that was the settled will of the left and the Labour movement during that referendum campaign. And I suppose the reason we took that view was, firstly, the argument that the Leave campaign and the reasons for it were driven by what was a carnival of reaction. It was about anti-migrant, race. It was just, it was a racist campaign. I would have loved to have, the idea that you go around knocking on doors and the reason people wanted to leave the EU was about neoliberalism and about the treatment of Greece was just fictitious. It was overwhelmingly about opposition to freedom of movement. That's what the referendum campaign was de facto about. And I don't think it was plausible or realistic to shape it in another direction. I think as well, what that meant in terms of the Irish peace process, I think as well, and the stresses that could place on the Irish peace process weren't even properly discussed but became very apparent. And I also think the problem was what Brexit actually meant in practice, because the danger was you either ended up with a kind of hard Brexit, which was economically and socially damaging, or you ended up with a Brexit where you ended up having to have rules imposed upon you without having any democratic say. It's just much more, that's the problem. It became much more complicated. So in an ideal world, my own view is, I look at the European Union, particularly its direction of travel, it's obviously not something I'm happy with. When we left, my view was, obviously I would oppose any re-entry to the European Union now. It unleashed a culture war, which was very damaging, because the whole point about, and this is why I flinched when you said, saw yourself as a Remainer, because obviously what was so toxic about the culture war that it unleashed is culture wars are so toxic to the left and class politics. Because what happened was Britain polarised on a constitutional issue. So all of a sudden, instead of politics being about who's got wealth and power and who doesn't, it was about being a Remainer and about being a Leaver. As if, a black supermarket worker in Hackney who voted for Remain was aligned with and had the same interests and was on the same team as David Cameron, or a former miner in Mansfield had the same class interest or same political interests as Jacob Rees-Mogg. It was catastrophic for the left, and it divided the nation, as constitutional issues do, in ways which were based on imaginary alliances which weren't real. Obviously I don't support re-entry into the European Union. In my view is we just have to make Brexit work as best as possible. It does impose challenges which is not, it's easier to call for leaving the European Union and then actually do it. Clearly, Brexit is now extremely unpopular in Britain. It's not popular, including people who voted against it, but I would prefer to shoot myself in the face than have another referendum. I mean, referendums on those sorts of constitutional issues are really catastrophic. What it did to the political fabric of Britain was horrendous. And it just has to be left alone. And over my dead body are we going to re-enter the European Union? But it was toxic. It was very bad for the left. It wasn't good for the left. It wasn't good for anyone of a progressive inclination. And it cemented a right-wing populist political project, which has caused really calamitous damage, I would say, to Britain.
Just like on that, do you think that the sort of ripple effect, the aftermath of Brexit, do you think it's, effectively destroyed any hope of having a proper left movement within Labour? Are we kind of like, in the UK, are you kind of stuck with the sort of politics within Labour that we've seen from Keir Starmer? Is that it now?
Well, that's separate from Brexit. Other than that, he styled himself as Mr. Remainer in a very cynical attempt to kind of, what he did is try to tap into the sweet spot of the Labour membership at that point. And the sweet spot of the, by 2019 was you had a Labour membership by that point, which was very committed to left-wing policy positions on things like public ownership, taxing the rich, but which was by that point just very opposed to Brexit. There's just that was the problem. And Keir Starmer tapped into that by being Mr. Remainer, who then was, I'll support all these domestic policies. And he's a con man. He executed the biggest political heist in British democratic history. There's never been such a deceitful political... he ran for that leadership, going on about, we're going to, nationalise all the key utilities, increase taxes on the rich, abolish tuition fees, went on about the virtues of immigration. He's just welcomed in one of the most right-wing Conservative MPs, Natalie Elphicke, who's currently involved in a scandal because her former husband was convicted of sexual assault, 2 convictions, and she had previously been suspended from Parliament for trying to influence the judge over that matter. And now it's come out, was interfered to try and, help her husband, who's a convicted sex offender. But her big shtick was bashing migrants. She's the MP for Dover, and her whole shtick is to stop the boats. And, he's positioned himself on, the most right-wing Labour leadership in history. And it's not like Tony Blair. Tony Blair in 1994, when he ran for leader, didn't pretend to be Mr. Tony Benn but competent. That was Keir Starmer's, basically, his position. And what he did is then crush democracy within the Labour Party. So he took it over on a prospectus of lies, abandoned everything. He's now supporting... this is just how grubby the guy is. During the Labour leadership contest, he did this very moving, touching speech against NHS privatisation. And he spoke about his dying mother and how she said to him, just in terms of how opposed she was to any private sector involvement in the NHS and how awful that would be. He literally he used an anecdote about his dying mother. And now he's like, anyway, we need private sector involvement in the NHS. We need to increase privatisation. You say, what the fuck? That is mad. That is mad. He has no moral compass. And this is the thing, I just think it's quite interesting, because people who call themselves liberals are really bad liberals, and people who call themselves social democrats are really bad social democrats. And I just think the best socialist is someone who's consistent about, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and social democracy in terms of investing in things. But these people are they're anti-liberal in terms of, on things like civil liberties, on things like the rights of migrants, and they're crap on things like, they support austerity. Labour now backs a fiscal rule which just maintains conservative austerity. They're opposed to increasing taxes on the rich. There's no investment possible, new investment for all the services that are falling apart. They've junked any proper... The last set of transformative policies compared to the Conservatives were on workers' rights, and they've just trashed that now as well. So, I left the Labour Party, and my view was what we need to do is, at the very least, put... what I've done now is to raise money for Green candidates or independent candidates. I'm not a Green, I'll be honest. That, at least, we need at the moment a holding position to put pressure on questions like public ownership, taxing the rich. Because at the moment, all the pressure comes from the right. We've got an extremely aggressive partisan right-wing media in Britain, far more than most European countries, which is an aggressive political actor in its own right. So at the moment, my view is that's what we need to do. We need to build. And my hope, actually, in the case of Britain is the level of destruction socially is so intense, and the lack of Labour answers to that is so profound. And the fact you do have a level of politicisation amongst younger people, which still exists for structural reasons. I think they'll come to power. They're already unpopular. They're only winning by default. And people are going to hate them. And I just think then the question is, do the far right fill that vacuum, or do the left get their act together? But I'm very hopeful. I think within a year or so, we'll be able to mobilise people and build something new.
Just, you spoke about the media there and how right-wing the media is in the UK. And I think being Irish and kind of looking at our own media and, complaining about our own media and mainstream media, it certainly seems to be way worse in the UK. How do you feel the left media can counteract that? What are the solutions for left media when faced with this, monster of a right-wing media? Is the future in, independent media? How do you counteract?
I'm very optimistic. Do you know? I'm very optimistic about that, because if you look. Obviously, the Sun is the kind of classic totemic example of the aggressive right-wing media in Britain. The Daily Mail, obviously, as well, and then we've got the Telegraph, we've got the Express. And they are ludicrously right-wing, and what they do is they spend their time obviously whipping up bile and hatred against marginalised minorities to distract people from the real problems and the real villains. They demonise anyone who stands against that consensus. They viciously oppose policies which threaten the status quo. And then the likes of the BBC allow their coverage to be framed by the priorities of those media outlets. So the political conversation is dictated by those media outlets, and then the BBC their coverage is set by those newspapers. Their circulations collapse. I mean, if you look at The Sun, The Sun's readership is so much lower than it used to be. And the rise of the internet obviously has allowed alternative media outlets to rise. We've got, for example, Novara, who have flourished. Even my video channel now is my much bigger platform than my Guardian column. I get millions of people watching those videos each month. And partly, what's happened in Gaza has, I think, accelerated what was already an underlying trend, which was, what you can see in Gaza, and the point about Gaza is people have seen too much that they can't unsee. They have heard too much they can't unhear. They have read too much they can't unread. If you look in the United States, why is it that younger Americans are so much more opposed to what Israel is doing and so much more likely to say it's a genocide? Younger Americans overwhelmingly say it's a genocide compared to older Americans. It is partly because they're more innately progressive. Their political consciousness has been more influenced by the rise of things like Black Lives Matter, which enables them to understand more questions of racist domination. But it is also because social media has enabled them to see, and other media outlets which have risen, have allowed them to see what's actually happening in Gaza and what Israel has done. And they've seen for themselves how they're not being told the truth by a mainstream media which has failed to frame its coverage around what Israel's leaders said they were going to do, which they then did, which has whitewashed their crimes, which has deferred to their lies over and over again. And people just look at that and they think it's ludicrous. And I think amongst younger people, this alone has been such a salutary experience because, scales have fallen from their eyes. They've seen it's self-evident that the media is not showing them the truth and reality of what is actually happening. So you can see that. That's why, my own video channel, Novara, that's why there's been such a rise and increase in people watching and subscribing and all the rest. But there's other in the US. Zetio, which I'm very honoured to be working with Mehdi Hassan on, he got fired from MSNBC, clearly because of his stance on Palestine. But then you look at MSNBC and the average viewing age is about 60. Then younger people aren't engaging so much with those old media outlets. He set up this new media company, and it's obviously attracting huge numbers of people who want an alternative. So I think now it's much easier to do. It's still challenging. Obviously, if you don't have multi-billionaires behind you, then that's hard. But I think the mainstream media in this particular crisis alone, I think it's going to suffer catastrophic consequences that it won't recover from, and that's an opportunity for us on the left to build our own media outlets.
So let's hope for a renaissance in terms of the left media. Owen, thanks very much for joining us. I think we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much, folks.
Cheers. Thank you.